If there is a singular philosopher before whom I feel dwarfed intellectually, it is Immanuel Kant. Kant is extraordinary. He's a force of nature. He is a thinker that for myself makes me feel like curling up in a fetal position and sucking my thumb when I contrast my thought processes with his. And I want to say I'm not a Kantian. I'm not a devotee of his thought. Nevertheless, the man is extraordinary. He's the most fascinating individual to me in the world of philosophy, in the time of the beginnings of the Enlightenment and the modern era. So as always, we're dealing with the motif, the picture, the analogy of doing ethics to that of aiming at a target and shooting, trying to hit the mark. Here, trying to hit the mark of what is good and what is morally right and what we ought to do according to our duty. Just a reminder, your decision for your final project is due this Thursday. Once you've chosen your final project, you're locked into it. Just be aware of that. So the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a period of time that runs from the 1600s, the 17th century, to the 1700s, the 18th century. And it's that which gives birth to the modern era, or to modernity, which is a time frame that ran from the late 18th century, late 1700s, up until most folks would say right around 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. So it needs to be said about the Enlightenment that it is not monolithic. Okay, what does that mean? It means it is not all the same. It looks different from country to country. This is Holly Hamilton Bleakley, who says the more one tries to understand what is distinctively modern, the more one becomes conscious of trying to impose a kind of artificial sameness upon a time period. That's what homogeneity means. Upon a time period which consists of very different thinkers and ideas. And it's the same way with the Enlightenment as it is with the modern, that it's given rise to by many different factors. Perhaps the most significant factor is an emphasis upon getting at the roots of reality by way of reason. There came a period of time in history when people began to trust in the West that they could figure out, they could understand their world by scientific observation. That was very important. And it was given rise to by a reaction to the religious wars of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. To make a long story short, with what could be said about that, in the time of the birth of the Enlightenment, what had happened was that the nations of the West, the nations of Europe, were federated together in what was called the Holy Roman Empire. This is not Rome. This is the Holy Roman Empire. The nations of Europe under the power of the papacy and under the power of Rome as far as the Vatican. That's what I'm looking for, the term the Vatican. And so what happened is that there was warfare on the eastern frontier of nations that were, or armies that were trying to invade the Holy Roman Empire. King Charles of France, the most powerful king in Europe at the time, went with the Pope, and they went to the eastern frontier and tried to fight against, and successfully fought against these invading armies. There's this old saying, while the cat's away, the mice will play. And during that time, there is a rebellion that takes place of sorts. And it's something that's been trying to happen for almost 100 years. But now it does happen because there's an environment where it can be given rise to. It's called the Protestant Reformation. And the Protestant Reformation was essentially the beginning of the end of the Holy Roman Empire. It's the nations that had been federated together now becoming separate and individual and allowing people to worship as they see fit rather than them having to be under the power of Mother Church. It's hard for you and me to begin to grasp, but your baptism as a Christian in the nations of the Holy Roman Empire was basically like the equivalent of your citizenship back then. And so when people started withdrawing from the Roman Catholic Church, worshiping differently, there was a negative reaction on the part of the Holy Roman Empire and the powers that be. It's again hard to conceptualize that the church and government were one and the same entity back then. And so there was initially a nonviolent response called the Counter-Reformation that then ultimately turned violent. But not at first. It wasn't started as a violent thing. And so once things became violent, the Roman Catholic forces came against the Protestant forces. Remember that Protestants just are Roman Catholics who have withdrawn from being Roman Catholics at that time. The name is Protestant. They're protesting certain things. So when it turns bloody and there's warfare going on, that warfare rages all over the nations of Europe for about the next 100 years in all different situations. It's estimated that about 1/3 of the federated states that comprise Germany, about 1/3 of their population died in those wars over the course of those 100 years. So you can imagine people were kind of sick of organized religion. And it was ironical. People now had the printing press, was a new technology that had been developed. They had the printing press so they could see that the individual in whose name all this fighting was going on was one who said, "My kingdom is not of this world," who said, "Those who live by the sword will die by the sword." Certainly somebody who did not encourage the establishment of there being countries that would be dominated by religious forces. That's kind of the opposite of what was taught in Christianity, and they got that. So they were sick to death of organized religion, and science is on the rise. It correlates historically with the rise of the modern sciences. And so the modern sciences, think of this, the Enlightenment begins in the 1600s and goes through the 1700s. Well, the 1600s is when Isaac Newton and Robert Boyle and a number of other famous individuals who gave us all these different laws by which we would understand our world came into existence. It's the same century in which the British Royal Society was given rise to. And so things are changing rapidly, and people are starting to shift their emphasis as far as how do I do life away from religion towards a secular state. So this is Immanuel Kant, and he's writing about enlightenment. The word Aufklärung is the German word for enlightenment. So he says, Aufklärung is our release from our self-imposed tutelage. Can also be translated immaturity. That is, this self-imposed tutelage, a state of inability to make use of our own understanding without direction from someone else. Specifically, he means the church and priests and people who would tell you, this is how your world works, and try to dictate that to you. This tutelage, this self-imposed tutelage, is it's self-imposed when it causes lies, when its cause lies not in our own reason, but in a lack of courage to use our reason without direction from someone else. So we don't need to be asking for permission to think from the church and from those who are in power in the government. So he's saying, have courage to use your own reason. That is the motto of enlightenment. Have courage to use your own reason. And eventually he will become a university professor, and that's his desire for his students, as you're going to see. He really wants them to use their own reason. Aufklärung, which means a clear out, and was the term with which they denoted the Enlightenment, started being used in Germany in the early 1700s. From that point forward, amongst German intellectuals, there was a sense of a new era of rationality having begun, and of the superstitions of the past being discarded and left behind. The usage of human reason and scientific empiricism would now liberate society from the restraints of religion and tradition and what Kant called arbitrary authority. So that's not enough information about the Enlightenment, but it tells you the environment, the milieu in which Kant was living. So this is ethics of the person is what we're talking about when we're talking about Kant. Now, just hit the pause button here for a second. I've given you background on Bentham and on Mills, not as much as I'm going to give you on Kant, but there's a reason why. Pedagogically, there's a reason why I want to give you this background. It allows some of you to remember the material better if this is done. For about 1/2 of us, we're not that interested for, let me, by way of analogy, say with a football game or a baseball game, because if there's no persons involved, if there's no drama, if there's nothing human, if there's no relationships in the picture, then these are a bunch of guys just running around out on a field or out on a court or out on a pitch with numbers on their back. And for about half of the population, if we can know something about the lives of the people who are playing the game, now we can be interested in the game. And I think it's the same way with philosophers. If they're just somebody who's a name, they'll just remain a name, and they're not that interesting. And folks, Kant needs to be paid attention to because he's kind of extraordinary. The other fellows were both geniuses. Bentham and Mill were both geniuses. Extraordinary. I mean, if you remember, Bentham was learning Latin at 3 years old, and Mill was learning Greek at 3 years old, and they both had their masters, their bachelors and their masters before the age that most of us are like in our first or second year of college. So that's why I'm getting into this. Now, This is a famous saying from Kant. This is in his best-known book, the first of his books, that starts off this avalanche of books that he starts producing in his 50s. He says, "Two things fill my heart with ever-renewed and increasing awe and reverence, the more often and the more steadily we meditate upon them. The starry firmament above," he liked to look at the natural world and the night sky, "and the moral law within." He was astounded by the fact that he had a conscience and he knew what was right and wrong in his heart. He felt that he knew this already. The knowledge was present, and one just needed to use one's intellect in order to be able to identify the law. So he's born in Königsberg, East Prussia, in 1722. Don't worry about dates. You're not going to be tested on dates in this course. But Königsberg is the most significant, the most powerful state in the German Confederation at that time. So he's born there in Königsberg. He's raised in a pietist household. What does that mean? It's a religious household, but it's not one that focuses on creeds and doctrinal kinds of things. To be pietist means these folks were deeply spiritual. There would be an emphasis on prayer and fasting and those sorts of things. So that's what his parents were like. And he was not opposed to his parents' faith, although he was not somebody who practiced a religious faith the way that other people in his time did. He wasn't opposed to his parents' faith. At one point in time, he says, because of his love for his parents and the environment that was going on in his country, he said he was going to destroy reason in order to make room for faith for people like his mom and dad. But that's a different story for a different time. He's raised in this pietist household. He's a brilliant student, by the way. By the time he's 16 years old, that becomes pretty obvious. He's a student of Martin Knudsen in logic and metaphysics. To be a student of Martin Knudsen would be sort of like being at Harvard and having Michael Sandel today. He's a student of the guy who's the best professor in that field during his day. So he's born in 1722. Notice that he secured his doctorate in 1755, so that's 33 years later. This fellow was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and it was not from a family that had a lot of money. So he was a student, and he distinguished himself as a brilliant student, but for him it was a slow process. He's gaining speed. So Bentham and Mill are racehorses right out of the starting gate, and they're doing amazing things when they're in their 20s. Kant is plodding along slowly. I would remind you that Einstein, people did not realize what a brilliant man he was early on. In fact, they thought perhaps he was a little mentally handicapped and seemed slow to many people. Kant's more like Einstein than like Bentham and Mill. He's moving along and he's building up speed. He's brilliant, and people have recognized his brilliance, but they don't know how brilliant. He's offered chairs, that means the chairmanship of a department, in poetry, both at his own and at Jena University. Jena is a very distinguished school of the time. So he's offered the department head in poetry at both of those places. One of the things that's fascinating about that is you may remember that Plato was a poet, and Plato was a playwright. And so what this tells us is Kant is not going to be boring. Sometimes his intellect will dwarf us and make us feel intimidated if we read his books. But he's not a boring man, and he's a man who does love the aesthetic. Remember that John Stuart Mill was starving for the aesthetic in his world. Well, Kant's got plenty of it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be offered a chairmanship of a department of poetry. He's appointed ordinary professor of logic and metaphysics at Königsberg. But before that, until he gets that appointment, he received this. Until that happened, he supplemented his income as a librarian. Now, it needs to be said, in his time, people got paid by the number of students that took their classes. They didn't get some automatic income. They didn't get some stated salary. The number of students that took your classes was what determined how much income you would earn, which is a fascinating practice, and perhaps we should explore going back to that. But here's the thing. Until he received this professorship, and during these years when he's getting his doctorate, he supplements his income as a librarian, which means he's helping people with research, and he knows where to go to find information. That's important. So this begins what we call Kant's pre-critical period. I always use the terminology in my classes of he's percolating, and most of my students do not know what a percolator is until you talk about it, and then most of them have seen it. So a percolator is an old kind of a coffee maker that has a little rod that goes down the middle of the coffee pot and a little bucket up on top that holds the coffee grounds. And as the water boils, it comes up through this little rod and bubbles over into the little cup that's holding the coffee grounds, and then it seeps back through holes and it percolates. And it's so pop, 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 pop. The water's coming up and it's percolating. Slowly, the coffee's being made. And I want to say that Kant seems to be like percolating intellectually during this period of time. So get this. He lectures during these years on logic, metaphysics, ethics. That's all philosophy, right? Logic, metaphysics, and ethics. Physics, mathematics, geography, anthropology, pedagogy, that's the philosophy of how to teach, and mineralogy. Any of you guys got professors you think that could do all of those topics? He's sort of extraordinary. He's considered an excellent lecturer. By the way, he uses humor and stories in his lectures, which was not approved of by a lot of educators at the time. They thought that that was not the right way to go about things. But he's considered an excellent lecturer, and there's a wait list for his classes. So going on from there, he stated that his purpose in his lectures was to help his students stand on their own 2 feet. Remember that thing about Aufklärung? That you're going to get away from this self-imposed tutelage? It's going to help them stand on their own 2 feet. Although he was not traveled, he was a very sociable and engaging man. So much so that people, his luncheon parties were kind of famous, and people hoped that they would get an invitation to come to Kant's house at some point in time for a luncheon party. And he'd have singers and people involved in the arts and ship's captains and explorers, all these different sort of people who would be there. It was quite a thing. Between his appointment of professor, which is in 1770, and 11 years later, 1781, which is the release of the Critique of Pure Reason, the first of his books, and he writes by the pound early on. It's a big book. He seems to have been working out his own philosophy. He had a heavy lecture schedule throughout this time of his life. And so I want to back up there. I meant to comment on that. I thought that there was a bullet point about that. He's got this heavy lecture schedule throughout this time of his life. And he gets done with his lecture and he goes home. He's now pumped up after he's given a lecture. And that's when he starts writing on his books. That's the time frame. Right after his lectures, he's working on his books. So one of the things this tells us is he's an extrovert. Extroverts are fed by their external world. I'm on the edge of being an introvert. So after I get done teaching at Husson, normally I'm teaching in person in class, I'm tired and I need to rest because I'm fed by my internal world. And so teaching and interacting with students is something I love, but I'm not pumped up. Kant's pumped up afterwards. Going on, he held that his non-philosophical lecturing, things like anthropology and geography and mineralogy, was essential for his students' learning so that they might understand the part which experience played in our knowledge. Thank God for a professor like this. I have had a number of people who, when I've been in education, getting my master's and getting my PhD, who were what I would call academia nuts. They were people who had been, from the time they were a youngster who graduated from high school, all they'd ever been in was the university. And they'd never had to have a real job out in the real world and interact with real people. So their heads are completely filled with theory. Kant isn't like that. And he wants his students to have a wide and varied sort of a knowledge. So he wants them to know about all different fields. And he thinks that through that they would have experience, and that experience would help them. He wants them to be practical in their knowledge and not just filled with theory. Thus, contrary to what one might think, he's not an advocate of what we call theorizing in the void. He's not somebody who just comes up with ideas out of his head. You might think he was because he was so brilliant, but he's somebody who wants to make sure whatever he comes up with is going to work in the real world. He's a meticulous planner and organizer of his time, so much so that people, I don't think it's spurious, I think it's true when you hear these stories, people would set their clocks by the time they saw him taking his walk, because he methodically, kind of obsessive-compulsively, walked the same walk at the same time every day. He rose around 4:45 a.m. and spent an hour drinking tea, smoking a pipe, and thinking over the day's work. Now, again, to me this is important. He's thinking over the day's work, and he's going to be preparing for his classes. I have had professors for whom the thing that they're teaching is like cold mashed potatoes. It doesn't excite them. They've taught it a lot of times in the past, and they just are saying the same old words. I've also had professors who are constantly looking for ways to illustrate the things that they're teaching in new ways and to make new connections with their students so that they infuse their students with enthusiasm. That's what Kant is doing. He's drinking tea, he's smoking a pipe, he's thinking over the day's work, and he's kind of planning his strategy for how he's really going to say this to his students. From 6 to 7, he prepares his lectures. Well, he's been giving these lectures for years. So why does he need to spend an hour to prepare his lectures? From 6 to 7 he prepared his lecture, which he delivered at either 7 or 8 according to the time of the year. And the lectures ran for about 2 hours, and they were packed. When they were over, I guess I did have a bullet point about this, he would then go write, and he just was like, it was like he got filled with energy by teaching his class, and he had to have an outlet, so he'd start writing his books. Afterwards, he'd go home and start writing his books. At midday, he took a meal, a planned meal, with company, people who had been invited. This was prolonged. He thought this was something that was good for him and for others. This was something that would make him well-rounded and make him not just a theoretician. After lunch, he took a walk for about an hour at the exact same time every day, it should be said. It's said that Immanuel Kant was a bachelor of such regular habits that the good people of Königsberg would adjust their clocks when they saw him stroll past certain landmarks. I've read this in so many places and heard it from so many sources that I've come to believe that it's true and not just one of those stories about this superpowered guy. So after lunch, he took this walk for about an hour at the same time every day. Evening was for reading and reflection. Bedtime was always 10 o'clock. And between the Critique of Pure Reason in 1781 and his death, he produced a crazy number of books. Here they are. So you can see them all listed here. This isn't all of them, but this is most of the significant ones. In this course, we will especially look at the second bullet point, Fundamental Principles of the Metaphysics of Morals, which is called the Grundwerk in German. And then the Critique of Practical Reason, which is his book on ethics, his big book on ethics. The Fundamental Principles of the Metaphysics of Morals is his little thin book, condensing that. And then the Critique of Judgment, which is his book on aesthetics. And you can see there's a whole bunch of others. I'd remind you the Critique of Pure Reason came before these. So he was sociable, he's kind and benevolent, he was systematically thrifty, but he's very generous to people in need. He's a sincere and loyal friend, but by all accounts he's not somebody who's sentimental. However, he is very respectful of people. It's really hard to pin down his religious beliefs. He's friendly to religion. He certainly believed in God. He said we needed to have God for ethics to be in any way compelling. He felt that morality implied belief in a God. But that being said, he had no time for mysticism or typical forms of prayer. So I was in England on High Street in Oxford, and as I'm walking along, and I've been studying Immanuel Kant at the Bodleian Library, I suddenly come across this street, Logic Lane. I had to take a picture. It's University College is right there, and this is the street on which the logicians used to meet, so it became called Logic Lane. But if there's anybody whose street ought to have been called Logic Lane, it is Immanuel Kant. Where he's going with his ethics is to try to rise above just the creaturely, just the natural, and have it be that we would achieve our full potential as human beings as far as drawing upon our reason. So a famous quote from Katharine Hepburn to Humphrey Bogart in the movie The African Queen, where she has this kind of crass, crude guy she's dealing with, and she tells him, nature, Mr. Allnut, is what we're put on earth to rise above. It seems like Kant has much the same motivation, to rise above our nature and to really accomplish what our intellect could accomplish. Throughout his years of writing in the fields of philosophy, he maintained his interest in the natural sciences. He published scientific papers across the years while writing his books of philosophy. For instance, in 1785 he published a paper entitled On Volcanoes and the Moon, and until his death he remained very interested in this new field called Newtonian physics. So what he's about is the moral motivation of duty alone, unaided by our disposition. I'm going to stop the lecture there, and we'll pick it up in the next one.